Hello. Today is the National Day of Reflection, exactly 2 years since the start of the first lockdown in the pandemic, 23rd of March. And on this day of reflection, I'm really delighted to be joined for a bit of a reflection of our own with Denise Turner. Hi, Denise.
Hi, Ruth. Thanks very much for inviting me to talk today.
Dr. Denise Turner is Senior Lecturer in Social Work at the University of Chichester and has written and has done an awful lot of work in this area during the pandemic, kind of reflection in action, reflecting as it's all been happening, and of course now reflecting and thinking very hard for us as a profession and with us about the impact of the last 2 years on social work. So this is an important day to mark. And we thought we would just share quickly to start a few reflections of our own on where we were when lockdown started on the 23rd of March, 2020. I was pretty much here, standing pretty much here, as it were. I was in London, and my partner had been due to go abroad the week before. And I said, go now, because if you don't go now, I think you won't be able to go. Planes will stop flying to France, and it'll be okay, we'll sort it out, and we'll get back together soonish. So off he went, and I remained in London. I think the main thing that was preoccupying me, apart from keeping the work flowing with BASW and being supported by amazing staff who had been sorting out our technology for weeks, because actually it wasn't the start, was it? We knew this was coming. And so we were able to move all the staff online incredibly quickly, which was quite amazing. But I was also worried about my mum, who was in hospital with a broken hip. And I was very fortunate that my sister was able to act as her nurse, physiotherapist, OT, and stay with her for 10 weeks at home in lockdown with my dad. So that was my, I've got very vivid memories of those things happening when lockdown started. Where were you, Denise?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting to think about, isn't it? Because we were talking about the apocryphal story of the Kennedy moment that everybody remembers, and even I'm not quite old enough to remember that. But I do remember I was at home, and we had been following a series on the television, and I remember looking forward to the new episode and then not being able to concentrate on it at all because we watched the Prime Minister's speech just before. And I have two, they're grown-up children now, but they're still at home, and one of them's 18 and one of them's 23. So at that point, 2 years ago, they were 16 and 21. One of them just started sixth form college, doing A-levels, and the other one in the final year of a degree. And I think that's the bit that I remember most, that being quite worried about them, actually, what it was going to be like for these young people trying to finish or start education, take another step in their education, their social lives, their kind of development as young adults, because, and I still think about that. So I think so many young people, and I'm a social work educator, have had those 2 years taken out of their lives, and they've had such a difficult time, really, even if a lot of the practicalities around them haven't seemed that difficult, or they've had enough to eat, they've had Wi-Fi, they've had all those kind of just basic comforts. I still think that actually what they've been through in these 2 years has been a significant chunk of their lives and their understanding, and then followed really by a war. So it's been a very difficult time, I think, to be a young person. So that's where I was at home. I was with my kids, and I guess worrying, and I haven't really stopped worrying in different ways since.
Yeah. There's an awful lot of things that didn't happen, particularly for young people in education, and for certain other groups, I think, of people where life kind of, things that didn't stand still, actually, but the adaptations were hard, and there were lots of things not happening. we are very aware, both of us, about the fact that we're also almost a month after the start of the war in Ukraine.
Absolutely.
And that's on all of our minds, I'm sure. We might come back to thinking about how coming through this phase of the pandemic, because it's not over, and thinking about some of the things that Denise will talk about in terms of some of the supports and reflective tools and ways of coping that she has been very much involved with social workers, kind of have resonance to when we start thinking about all of the things we need to understand, and hopefully will be put in place for whether it's for refugees directly, and also for all the staff and the volunteers across Europe who are helping, and of course thinking about Ukraine for the longer term. It's an awful situation, not something we expected to be having to deal with when we thought maybe the pandemic was easing in some way. We would be in this situation in relation to that. But Denise, if I could just maybe, we were talking, weren't we, also about what is it that we're reflecting on in a way, what, just to sort of sum up the shape of that reflection and remembrance from your point of view, from the work you've been doing. Do you want to kind of say a bit about that?
I think that's a really good question. It's a day of reflection, and what is it that we're reflecting on? And for me, I think that's going to be very personal. Actually, that's going to be incredibly personal in both professional terms and personal terms. And I think there can be this idea that there's a kind of narrative about getting back to normal, how we're supposed to frame the pandemic now, and our own experience of it. And I think it's just very important that people are allowed to frame their own experiences, so that those experiences aren't framed for them. And for me, I suppose, thinking about my own personal narrative, I've had a lot of changes during this time, but one of the things that I've been involved with, as you've said, Ruth, is I've been involved in 2 edited books, one that was in the very start of the pandemic, and one that came out recently. And they're both books with kind of case studies, just personal voices, really, from people that are using services, from people that are in the education sector, from professionals, from students. So very personal accounts of what the pandemic's been like from all those different perspectives. And I guess for me, that's part of my reflection, that actually there's a lot of triumphs in those books, even if they're very small triumphs, just people learning how to use even something like this platform today, things that were really not that familiar to us, Teams, Zoom. I know there's also been a lot of talk about digital exclusion, about the ethics of some of these platforms. All of these things have become part of our kind of dialogue and weren't 2 years ago. And I guess some of the work that I've been doing is also just about the creative ways that people have found to come to terms with loss. And I think when we think about loss, it's not only the bereavements, and there's been too many of those, but also the losses that people have had in terms of their own professional identities, the kind of water cooler moments, where people get to chat and just to ask advice from a colleague, the safeguarding issues that there've been in terms of not, in the early part of the pandemic, not being able to do home visits, all of those kind of losses, and just the actual idea that we couldn't go out, that early part of the pandemic, and just thinking about where we were. I remember one of the things that most exercised me was that I couldn't go out. It was just this one walk a day. So as I've said, a lot of the work that I've been involved with has been around finding voices. So partly through the books that I've been involved with, giving voice to people's experience. But also I'm involved with a project in partnership with West Sussex, where we're building a digital archive and just inviting people to send in photographs, reflective photographs, so very much fitting with this day, of an image of what their experience of the pandemic has been like, and then just to contribute a few lines. So the image speaks for itself, but just to give some explanation of that image. And we're hoping that again, that will give a form of voice, a visual voice to people, just so that they don't feel forgotten within the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And the other thing, just before, just last sort of thing to say, is that I'm also involved with a project, a virtual Wobble space project, which is a form of sort of therapeutic supervision, also with West Sussex County Council, giving support, basically lending support to social workers so that, again, they have a voice to talk about what their experience of the pandemic has been. So I think part of it has been very much head down, get on with the job, you know, don't look up. And then when you do look up, a lot of what you may feel has been shaped, as I said before, by other people's narratives. Back to normal, get on, sort of keep calm and carry on. And I think it's very important with this day of reflection that we create different ways for people to reflect.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that. It really chimes with me. I think there is always a tendency, I think, when there's a traumatic experiences, collective traumatic experiences, collective difficult experiences, to get to kind of a point where almost the dominant narrative becomes, let's move on, when we're moving on now. And there's a relief that you might connect with that. If you can connect with it, there's a lot of, I think, relief. It's a very human experience. But your point there, that we actually all need to understand, I think, or many of us, I mean, we can't speak for anybody, can we? Yeah. But we have permission to think about our own narrative and what it's been like for us and the things that have been difficult or less difficult. Because sometimes it's hard to say. I mean, I know the first lockdown for me, I mean, I was on my own, and it was in the house with my neighbours and so on. But I was, you know, in quite centrally in London, and I'm just thinking these skies are so blue because there's less pollution, there's less cars, it's quiet, and there's this sort of strange kind of mixed kind of feelings. And at the same time, we were getting all the news in those first few months, weeks and months, of what was happening in care homes in particular. Terrible death toll starting to come through. So the narrative isn't just a kind of, you know, the story of what's happened to any of us is you know, very, very particular, even though there are lots of commonalities. And I guess we all need permission to for that. And some of us would have had really tragic times, and others not so much personal tragedy, but witnessing it or dealing with it at work. So, I mean, I think that's important, isn't it? And I guess with the work that you've been doing with Wobble, I think you might need to just briefly explain Wobble spaces. Although as social workers, we can probably work some of that out. But maybe that, you know, and how that comes through and validates that.
The Wobble spaces is something that's built on work that I was doing with a colleague from Goldsmiths University, and we did some workshops, mental wealth and wellbeing workshops. And they were commissioned, they were a response to the sort of conversation that we've been having about how do we support social workers at this time. Some of the social workers in the authorities that we were working in had experienced a lot of deaths, so deaths of service users and of colleagues. So we were asked to do some work around some of that. And I think everything that you've said really resonates with that as well, because actually what the social workers were saying was that it had been a time of great loss, but there had also been things that they wanted to carry forward from that as well. So it almost sounds like a cliche now, doesn't it? But I think it's important, you know, like the singing of the birds, you know, the discovery of parks or river, you know, down the road that they'd never had a chance to go and have a look at before. And while that can sound trite, I think, you know, while as you've said, all the tragedy's been going on, I do think it was very important for those social workers to be able to talk about those things. So that's about hope, and that's about their narrative. And so there was a participant in one of our workshops that I often quote that said that she'd realised that her identity had become her lanyard, and during the lockdown she'd been able to sort of separate a bit, as you know, and find a bit of herself as a person again. So we wanted to build on that experience, and Wobble spaces are they're actual physical spaces that are used a lot in the NHS. So they're called Wobble rooms, and they're a place that people can go to have a wobble. But there's problems, occasion with them being physical spaces because they get locked. They might be in a different building. You can't necessarily book in to have your wobble. So we were thinking about how could we use that model in social work. It's quite, as I've said, it's quite widely used in the NHS now, but it hasn't really transferred to social work. And the idea is that I think you and I have talked about this before, Ruth. We're both old enough to remember Weebles, which were a toy that was marketed as Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. And so the kind of idea of the wobble spaces is that it gives a place to support people where people can bring their stories and share their stories. And because that's one of the things that we found in the workshops, that there was something about people talking to each other. So it wasn't that people needed counselling or to go off and be supported individually. They needed to listen to each other's experiences, and they learned a lot from that. So that's where the wobble spaces come from, the idea of kind of wobbling but not falling down.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think that last point you're making there about what do people need in sort of just after or as a kind of a trauma is happening, or a great difficulty has happened, is that sense of, so often it's to find ways of being with people where you can have enough trust and enough freedom of sort of thought and expression to just share what you're experiencing, to have and to engage in those normal forms of natural forms, difficult words I know, but of sorts of social support and community.
And I think that's what people lost, a lot when and that's a lot of the feedback that we got, was that when people went online, they were at their kitchen table, and if they were having, or wherever, and if they were having a difficult meeting or a particularly distressing kind of interaction of any kind, when they pressed the button to leave, they were at home. So there wasn't that opportunity necessarily to just interface with colleagues, get that informal support that they would have been getting previously.
So it's something about providing ourselves as a profession with those reflective and supportive spaces. Some people are great at it. Some places where they work, there's great opportunities for that. But sometimes people that they're not available. We're not always the greatest at putting ourselves into that and recognising our own right to claim that space for reflection on what's really happened for us, not some stereotypical notion of what reflection or even remembrance or even memorialising might be.
I think that comes back to a word that you were using before about permission. I think it's just, and being with other people who are talking about their own experiences can give us permission to talk about our own. And sometimes those experiences resonate with others as well. And that can be helpful, because you think, oh, it's feeling isolated. I've been feeling on my own. I thought I was the only person who felt this, but that person feels it, or something similar as well. So those kind of permissions, I think, are incredibly important.
Yeah.
And as social workers, we're helpers, aren't we? But that's part of what we do. So we don't always think about what we need and having the permissions for that.
And I think the pandemic has shone a lot light on that. And there's so much more about wellbeing in so many different ways now being talked about by employers, by social workers ourselves. There's lots of bits of research emerging about how people, not only in social work, are saying that, I don't necessarily want to leave my profession, but I would quite like to work fewer hours. I want to take more time for myself, and all of that's really important. I think just to kind of finish in a way, we said we would do this for about this amount of time, the taster, and I guess just hoping that people would use it, kind of go away and think, well, what do you want to reflect on? Maybe very different things that we've talked about, but it is about that permission to kind of create that author your own narrative, really, about what it's been like for you the past couple of years. And we've talked a lot, heard a lot about mental health crisis across our society, and I think there can be a rush to the notion of that being about more clinical services, which can be extremely important, but actually we need to be each other's low-key, everyday, neighbourly therapists with a small t, in terms of listening to each other, whether it's at work or in our home lives, being that's being those sorts of supportive friends, colleagues, as well as professionals. And it does make me think as well about the kinds of supports that people now coming, hopefully at some point being able to get here from Ukraine, but all of that need that's going to emerge for refugees across Europe. And the kind of mental health distress and stress there. But the first thing that's going to really be needed is just open spaces and a kind of sense of being able to connect with people who are going to be kind. Absolutely. And understanding, and that's really where it starts. So absolutely. Kind of we'd hope that we'd get some investment in that kind of low-key, out of the way investment in helping people do that. Not all of it going into the kind of high-end, very expensive clinical services, of which they're not necessarily appropriate, and there just aren't enough of them. And they're not the right thing.
No, absolutely.
So just a few final words, if that, does that, you look like you agree with
that resonates hugely. I think there's two things that sort of spring to my mind. And I think the words that you use, just kindness and community, they're such important words. And the two things that I was thinking about was that during my work during the pandemic, one of the projects that I was involved with was with the National Care Forum and an organisation called NAPA, which works in care homes. And we just did a project where we worked mostly in social care, and people made memory boxes. We called them moment in time boxes, and just doing something. And there was something so low key, but so collective and collegiate about making these boxes together. And they're a testament to the time. They can be opened again in 10 years, and people have those kind of memories. And that, I think that resonates with, there's a man called Thomas Attig, who's an American grief theorist, and he talks about when we go through trauma or any sort of form of significant loss, we have to relearn the world. And I just think that's something that makes a lot of sense to me, that these kind of shifts and changes mean that we have to relearn some of the ways that we feel or think or experience the world. And I think, as you've said, the massive trauma that is happening in Ukraine is making us all relearn the world, even if that's in infinitesimal ways. We're having to think about this and what we can do, as you said, what we can do. And I just want to come back to your community, and kindness. I think those are such important and very underused, kindness particularly, very underused words. Yeah. So I think you're right. We might throw sort of high level resources at things, whereas actually kindness is something that still isn't given as much maybe credence as it should. So yeah, I think those would be my sort of closing thoughts, Ruth.
Denise, thank you very much. And I hope that anybody listening to this has a kindly day, starting with kindliness to themselves.
Yes.
About whatever your reflections are, and it is all entirely individual or personal. And I just hope that's one of the key messages, is that from this is whatever the day of reflection is for you, that it's your day. And Denise, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having this conversation with me. Always a pleasure. Thanks.
With you too. Bye.